our session. So welcome and thank you to everyone for joining us today, as well as those who will catch up later and watch our video. It is really a pleasure for the Commission on Ecosystem Management to present our latest publication on climate mitigation and biodiversity conservation, a product of several months of dedicated work under the leadership of our dear colleague, Aminur Rahman. And I want to extend a special thanks to him for his outstanding leadership and commitment, to Shane Orchard, as well as other members of the group of co-authors and peer reviewers whose valuable contributions help us to complete this publication ahead of two important events that are taking place this year: COP16 of the Convention on Biological Diversity and COP19 of the Climate Change Convention. The linkages between climate change and biodiversity have been central to the agendas of both conventions, as climate change affects ecosystems, species, populations, and communities at various scales. The way we manage ecosystems significantly influences the extent of climate change and our ability to adapt to it. Conversely, without addressing climate change, it will be difficult to halt biodiversity loss and prevent ecosystem degradation. Additionally, without protecting ecosystems and their capacity to store carbon, meeting emission reductions targets will be challenging. And achieving both is essential for efforts to combat poverty and enhance human well-being. Currently, global mitigation policies are promoting a big shift in emission reduction activities to achieve net zero targets by 2050. Carbon markets mechanisms are being adopted as key instruments in mitigation policies. Although recent studies have explored some impacts of climate change mitigation initiatives, an integrated perspective on these developments is very much needed. The Commission on Ecosystem Management of IUCN, for those of you who are not very much involved with our work, we have the mandate to adopt ecosystem-based approaches and nature-based solutions to achieve biodiversity conservation and address climate change impacts and contribute to human well-being. Our mandate, adopted in Marseille in 2020, is based on the ecosystem approach definition and principles as endorsed by the 5th Conference of the Parties of the CBD back in the year 2000. Since 2008, the Commission has been working specifically on climate change issues, mainly on climate change adaptation. As you may know, CEM is one of the member founders of the Friends of Ecosystem-Based Adaptation, the well-known FIBA network that currently has more than 100 organizations that are promoting worldwide the adoption of ecosystem-based adaptation and uptake of nature-based solutions in adaptation and resilience efforts around the world. In 2019, we agreed on complementing this work on adaptation with ecosystem-based mitigation, considering that impacts of climate change mitigation actions were creating a significant ecological footprint in our ecosystems, affecting not only the possibilities for adaptation, but the livelihood of local communities. This is why the Thematic Group on Climate Change and Biodiversity Policy and Practice identified as one of the main priorities to contribute to setting a standard for carbon markets to ensure delivery of sustainable net gains on biodiversity and maintaining ecosystem integrity while protecting indigenous people and local communities' rights and traditional knowledge. This publication that we will be presenting today provides an update synopsis of the existing carbon markets mechanisms implemented worldwide, how these mechanisms are related to natural ecosystems, and the potential contribution of natural ecosystems in the right design of nature-based solutions to reduce carbon emissions. It also provides recommendations for policymakers, including several immediate steps that will help to close the gap between the climate mitigation and biodiversity conservation agendas. The IUCN urges immediate and decisive action over the next 6 years to address the climate crisis and keep the 1.5-degree limit within reach. It calls for a comprehensive and synergistic approach to tackling the interlinked climate and biodiversity crisis, which must be reflected in the 2025 National Determined Contributions, the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans, and all related programs of work of both conventions. IUCN also advocates for increasing climate and biodiversity finance, prioritizing high-integrity nature-based solutions for both adaptation and mitigation with direct access to indigenous peoples and local communities. Ensuring the highest levels of environmental and ecosystem integrity in the implementation of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is crucial for IUCN, which insists on maintaining robust ecological and social safeguards in its application. IUCN also recommends that any explicit use of nature-based solutions within Article 6 should adhere to the IUCN Global Standard for Nature-Based Solutions. IUCN strongly encourages all stakeholders, including the private sectors, civil society, to act ambitiously and effectively in addressing the intertwined climate and biodiversity crisis and to support an equitable and just transition for all. There is an intention to discuss the possibility of presenting a motion based on the results of this study, making sure that IUCN has a clear policy towards existing and future development of carbon markets and their connection with biodiversity. We expect that the findings of this report will contribute to improve not only the negotiations and the position of IUCN in the coming 2 COPs, but also to develop this clear policy on carbon markets in the next World Conservation Congress. This dialogue of today will give us some highlights of the findings and that will be presented by Aminur and Sean and followed by an interactive discussion by the panelists. So once again, thank you very much for joining, and I give the floor to Aminur to continue with the agenda for today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Angela. Yeah, Angela nicely gave you the brief introduction of this publication and why we have done this. So before showing our findings, what we have found and through the review of this whole carbon market aspects and the biodiversity conservation. So myself and Shane will present the main findings, but just before going to that, I want to have a quick perception survey of the audience. So what people already know about this topic, and maybe later you can find the results of our results presented in our report, and then you can see the perception, what new things we have brought up. As Angela already said, that we have looked at different aspects of carbon markets and biodiversity issues in this publication. I just want to point out some of the key questions we have looked at and we try to answer in this publication. So one of the main thing was to see the status of the carbon markets at the global level. So what kind of market mechanisms, tools are in place, and to what extent they are playing role, and how much global carbon emission are covered by those global carbon markets. Then we have looked at what types of carbon mitigation projects are dominant in the carbon markets, because most of the carbon market mechanisms are basically related to different kinds of carbon mitigation projects. And especially we looked at, since our report is basically related to the biodiversity and ecosystem conservation. So we try to look at what types of different ecosystem-based projects are considered in climate mitigation programs. And then we specifically looked at whether there is any impact of climate mitigation projects on biodiversity and ecosystems. And lastly, what are the policy options uh, uh, we can develop or we can take to reduce the negative impacts. So these are the key questions we addressed in our publication. And before showing our results, I want to just have a quick survey. I'll share one Google survey form in our chat box so that you can have a quick look and you can answer just 4 questions there. So I'll share it now in your chat box so that you can go there, you can answer a question. It will take only one or 2 minutes maximum. Then I will show the results. Okay, as I said, what we have tried to look at the global aspects. So first we'll give you the global aspects, and then I will show some examples of different carbon markets, what kind of projects they are involving with those carbon trading system. As you know that when you look at the global emission scenario, global greenhouse gas emission scenario by sectors, this is the estimate from 2020, and the estimate shows that we have total global greenhouse gas emission was 47.5 gigaton carbon equivalent. It's basically from the anthropogenic sources. And you can see on this graph that the most of the emission are coming from the energy sector. Then the second largest one was the agriculture, forestry, land use, and some from the waste and energy industrial sector. And if you look at the energy consumption, basically energy consumption in the industry, buildings, transport sector, all those sectors which are basically in this modern world, we cannot run without electricity or energy. So that's the emission scenario. And then we try to look at what are the carbon pricing mechanisms are in place to deal with those kind of emission reduction projects. In this report, I mean, you know that the climate mitigations, there are many different types of tools for climate mitigation. Okay, and one of the big thing coming up in recent years that we have to use the emission trading system or the monetary mechanism to reduce carbon emission. So we try to look at different types of carbon pricing instruments globally applied in different countries, and we just classified into 2 broad categories, direct and indirect. Direct pricing mechanisms are already, you know, that those are basically the carbon taxes or the emission trading system or the carbon crediting mechanisms. These are basically the financial tools. For example, carbon taxes are directly imposed on the use of energy or fuel charges, okay? And I mean the taxes for emission from any kind of industrial transport or any kind of activities. And emission trading systems are developed, basically it's a marketplace where you can say the cap and trade. So government can set up a kind of limit of emission from the different sources. And then the polluters who will produce more emission, then they have to buy credit from the market, and which are available from the other people or other polluters who are using less credit than the allowable limits. And another one is the carbon crediting mechanisms. That's basically the carbon offsetting. So if you reduce or if you have the carbon reduction or the carbon sequestration mechanism within your projects, then you can uh, you can generate carbon credit and you can sell it to the market. And the indirect mechanisms are the kind of the fuel tax or subsidies or commodity taxes, which are not basically related to the per unit carbon emission, rather than those are kind of based on assumptions that if we impose tax on fuel or commodities, then people will use less fuel. That this is kind of the indirect mechanisms. And we have tried to look at what are the different levels those different types of carbon pricing instruments are in place. And we have found that some of them are at the international level, like the clean development mechanisms and RED Plus and the European Union emission trading systems. Those are playing uh, those are active in the international level. But there are some national and subnational level markets, like the national emission trading systems, which are developed in many countries, and some regional level, provincial level. Like in US, they have provincial level uh, emission trading system. In Canada, they also have different provinces, different market. But in China, for example, they have national level market as well as the provincial level or provincial level markets. Apart from the government or the intergovernmental run markets, there are some voluntary carbon offset program. Most of you are familiar with like verified carbon standard or gold standard, Plan Vivo. Those kind of voluntary carbon markets are there. We have looked at the global distribution of those carbon market mechanisms. And the recent report from World Bank in 2020, they found that there are 71 carbon pricing instruments are active, and 37 are carbon tax mechanisms, and 34 emission trading systems globally now active. And those are covering 23% of the total global greenhouse gas emission. So in the survey, I put one question that how much these carbon market mechanisms are covering, and this is kind of, you're right that this is less than 25%. And most of the mechanisms are, you can see on the North America, some are most of them are in Europe, North America, and China, Philippines, in those countries. Still, many developing countries are out of this kind of market mechanisms. And US, there are provincial level, but they also allow, the carbon mitigation project registered throughout the nationally and internationally. But at the national level, there is no market there in US. And in Russia, we did not find any kind of market mechanisms active there. We looked at different sectors. So which sectors are more, which sectors are basically covered by the major environment emission trading systems? And we found that the power sector, basically the energy, then industry, buildings, and transport sectors. So those are the main thing. Main sectors are covered by different climate mitigation projects, which are registered for emission trading system. And this is kind of aligned with the emission scenario. As you have seen, the emission is mostly from the energy sector, industry, and energy use in transport. So this is quite aligned with what's the emission sources are, and the projects are in line with that. We have also looked at the carbon crediting mechanisms. It's basically the different carbon offset programs. And if you look at this graph, because at the beginning, in early 2000s, at that time, the clean development mechanisms were kind of developed and initiated by UNFCCC and those are promoted globally. But later on, now the CDM projects are, a number of CDM projects are going down, and the major share of those kind of carbon offset programs are taken over by the voluntary carbon markets. So now in 2021, the almost 74% carbon crediting programs are registered with the voluntary carbon markets. We have also looked at the what kind of which sectors are basically covered by these carbon crediting mechanisms, and here again we found the energy sector, energy efficiency, renewable energy, forestry, transport, and industry sectors are the main sectors. Then this is I'm just putting more detailed information about the CDM projects. So we looked at what kind of projects, where the CDM projects are mainly located. And we found that in China, this is, I think as of 2023, we found that from the UNFCCC database, around 8,000 projects are registered, but most of them are in China, nearly 50%. But then we have in India, and other countries, and Brazil, Vietnam, and mostly these are developing countries, because the CDM projects were basically the design was like that the highly polluters, industrialized countries were investing on carbon offset programs in developing countries and getting the credit from there. Okay, so those kind of mechanisms are in place. Then we have looked at the distribution of different sectors, and again, you can see the energy sector, renewable and non-renewable energy projects are the major share of CDM projects. So almost 75%. And then we have waste handling, waste management disposal, and the manufacturing industry, emission reduction in the manufacturing industry had also some share. We have also looked at some of the voluntary carbon offset markets. So what kind of projects they are basically registering and dealing with. And we found some of the interesting thing here. You can see this is results for the verified carbon standard, VERA. They have also registered the energy industry. I mean, mainly the energy, renewable and non-renewable energy projects. Out of almost 2,000 projects, they almost more than 50% are in this sector. Then they have agricultural land use projects, and then energy demand management and the waste handling. So those are the major project category. And again, you can see this, most of the projects are registered from Asia, and then Latin America and some African countries, very few from the Europe and North America. Again, we have seen another register. This is Carbon Action Reserve, which is basically based in America. And what we have seen here, this voluntary market, they are basically registering projects related to landfill gas capture or livestock gas capture. So most of the projects are registered. This data for US. So in US, this kind of projects are registered within this carbon registry. And then we have American carbon registry. Also, we have looked at for US, and again, you can see the industrial process emission and the forest carbon and transport sector. Those are the main sectors they have covered. Also, we have seen Gold Standard. This is another big platform. Gold Standard, they have covered mainly the renewable energy projects and the community service activities and waste management, those things. Very few related to forest and energy efficiency. And again, most of the projects are from Asia and Africa and Latin America. We have also looked at RED Plus program. And you can see RED Plus programs are basically developed in developing countries, Asia and African countries and South America. And what we found that up to 2020, 50 developing countries, they have submitted their forest reference level, and which covers basically 70% of the forest coverage within those countries. And the report says that around 6.3 billion ton of carbon emission reduction has been reported from those projects. Yeah, so in summary, as I said, that we have found that the multiple carbon pricing instruments are in place around the world, and most of the emission trading system projects, they cover the power industry and building sectors, building and transport sector projects. And still the carbon trading system and the carbon tax programs basically covering only less than 25% of global carbon greenhouse gas emission. And it's a good thing that the voluntary carbon offset markets are booming, and it's already covering almost 74% of the total carbon offset programs around the world. But still, there is a long way to go. And when you looked at the relation to the ecosystem, so which type of ecosystems and whether the ecosystem-based projects are covered by different carbon mitigation projects or not. And we found very few, and mostly the forest-based forest management projects are considered as a carbon mitigation projects. But other than that, there are only some wetlands and some tidal wetlands and agriculture, agro-ecosystem projects are also there. I think Shane will present those things. So what ecosystems we have, those markets have covered. And you will learn more from Shane. So how these kind of projects are impacting, especially when you can see the energy projects are the main share of all these carbon mitigation projects. So we are developing the many renewable projects, wind turbines, solar power, hydropower. We are looking at the future of our energy is basically renewable. But whether there will be a big impact on ecosystem or not, if we implement globally larger scale. So Shane will present more about this. So I'll hand over to Shane, and we'll take it from there. Thank you so much.
So, kia ora tātou. Hopefully you can see that there. Ko Shane Orchard tokunga, no Aotearoa ahau. So I'm Shane Orchard, I'm based here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm the Oceania Regional Chair for the Commission at the moment. And my role in this project was to coordinate some of the work on impacts of these climate mitigation projects on biodiversity and ecosystems. And we were looking at impacts in both directions, so positive and negative. And so I'm going to attempt to whiz through this section of the report and summarise some of the findings. Our focus on impacts, the objectives were to have a global snapshot really of trends, particularly looking at the nature-based projects. So the projects amongst that big selection that Amina has summarised, the ones that are really based in natural environments that might have an ability to impact upon them. And we were interested in the magnitude and direction of the global picture at this point in time. And to gather that snapshot, we were basing our review on the implementation literature. So particularly around project types that have been in place for some time, and there's some knowledge being generated on what their impacts might be. So we're going to get started on looking at the potential impacts of 7 main types of projects, and you can see there on the slide there in 2 main sectors. So renewable energy sector, 3 types there, and looking at some of the more nature-based solutions in the conservation and restoration sector. And this is looking at the climate mitigation project's effects on biodiversity and natural ecosystems. And in addition to that view, we also have a chapter that looks at the reverse flow, which is looking at the potential for biodiversity and natural ecosystems to assist with climate mitigation objectives. So I'm going to run through this section first. And just a word of warning, the next few slides are quite busy, and that's quite deliberate so that people that couldn't join us on the webinar today had a resource they could look at later. So I will whiz through them quite quickly and just highlight the key points for each of those 7 project types, and then move to some of our findings overall and recommendations at the end, and hopefully then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So the first one we're going to look at is wind farms. And bear in mind, this is a review of the implementation literature. So the potential negatives that came out here were around habitat disturbance, especially in the construction phase, but also during the operational phase. You've obviously got the footprint of the turbines themselves and related infrastructure, but quite a lot of studies coming out on mortality from direct collision with turbines. Birds and bats particularly featured in those studies, and increasing number of studies looking at the turbine noise and that kind of effect on either avoidance or communication and behavioural aspects of wildlife that could therefore have quite a larger footprint of effect in the natural ecosystem. Some of the potential positives, they were fairly few and scarce in the literature, but some interesting studies on benthic habitat creation around offshore wind farms. Obviously, there's a trade-off there between what was created by the wind farm footing and what was there before, but it does hint at other potential opportunities for green engineering associated with this type of infrastructure. So some considerations for weighing up those pros and cons are that essentially the footprint of impacts is relatively large if you consider those avoidance and wildlife behavioural effects of a wind farm, even though the individual turbines might be quite spaced in the environment. The construction of access and maintenance infrastructure would add to that footprint if it's needed, such as new roads. And some papers and other studies pointing to supply chain effects and material requirements of these technologies. And that point comes up even more strongly in our next example, which is looking at solar farms. So turning to solar farms now, some of the potential negatives again were around habitat destruction and wildlife displacement of the facilities themselves. And in relation to, say, wind farms, you've got something that's got a smaller footprint really, but it's a more intensive land use. There's a couple of types of solar farms, and the concentrated solar power type plants have some hazardous materials associated with them on site, which has been the cause of concern in some studies. And otherwise, there's a similar effect that you find with wind turbines, with increasing number of studies pointing to collisions with solar panels in particular, or transmission infrastructure, especially related to water birds that might be attracted to the plant. So that's a specific effect that's receiving quite a bit of attention actually here in New Zealand just at the moment. In addition to that, the solar arrays create more indirect effects in the surrounding environment. A lot of them are to do with some hydrological effects of either the cleaning of the plant and water use, or microclimate effects associated with the area within the footprint or just in the surrounding environment. And so that causes a change in the landscape that the plant's located in, and it could be a problem for things such as providing an area that's a vector for invasive species in a landscape that wouldn't otherwise have that there. On the flip side, potential positive of that pointed to in some studies are that some species might be advantaged by those conditions in the area, but it seems to be a fairly selective potential positive. So weighing up those pros and cons, some of the considerations are that, again, you've got a relatively large footprint for the type of infrastructure that it is. You've again got those access maintenance infrastructure considerations that might add to that footprint. And in this case, quite overt concerns about supply chain effects and the material requirements going into this technology, particularly around the dependence on mining, and that would potentially need to be upscaled if this technology was upscaled globally. And potentially just coming into focus now, end of life concerns around photovoltaics in particular, about what plan is really in place for disposing them, or in other ways of using them after the end of life of, say, 25 years. So that's sort of like a new issue that's becoming better known. Turning now to hydroelectric power projects. Potential negatives here, again, habitat destruction from having either dams in river valleys or dewatering of river valleys in the case of run-of-the-river systems. And this form of development alters the natural flow, sediment, and nutrient transport regimes of the river valley, causing a range of effects. Some of the more obvious ones are connectivity effects on wildlife movement and other biota and their dispersal patterns associated with that barrier in the river valley, but also a lot of extra indirect or less obvious effects to do with changes downstream and to the riparian ecosystems from the change in hydrology, particularly in the downstream direction, but also upstream in relation to reservoirs. And geodiversity impacts on natural features and landscapes and the ecosystem services associated with them. Some of the potential positives could include the habitat value of the reservoir. Obviously, that's in the case of a dam, obviously that's trading off against what was already there. And so weighing up those pros and cons, some of the considerations are the spatial extent of impacts of this form of development are actually really extensive, considering the upstream and downstream connections. Again, you've got access and maintenance infrastructure to consider, and that can be quite important for hydro projects that might be proposed for, say, pristine environments where there isn't that form of infrastructure in place already. And looking at this in a global picture, the cumulative footprint of these projects is already quite extensive. So, for example, nearly 3,000 projects are already funded globally by CDM. And compared to the other two renewable energy projects we looked at, the place-based impacts are quite overt with hydroelectricity because of its dependence on rivers. So it really does put a focus on the question of whether or not rivers can be sacrificed and how many of them, and whether or not they're really substitutable as resources, because this form of development really relies on exploiting that entity in the environment. So now we'll turn our attention to the 4 conservation restoration related project types, and we're going to start with avoided deforestation. So the most well-known example of this form of project is the REDD+ program that Emma was featuring before. And so this is where you've got a line of finance that is designed to keep forest in place so that we don't lose the carbon store that it represents. Some of the well-known negatives from especially evaluations of REDD+ program are the concept of leakage, which is where we have the pressures on deforestation simply shifted to other areas that end up becoming deforested, and that is seen as an inefficiency in the overall outcomes from something like REDD+ program. So you need some safeguards in place to prevent that, so that you don't just have one forest protected somewhere and it just shifts the pressure to somewhere else. The literature on implementation of REDD+ in particular is pointing to the need to consider all of the ecosystem services represented in the forest, because there are some examples where some might be favoured over others. So you can imagine right away that carbon sequestration, for example, or storage might be, if that becomes the only objective, then that might direct the outcomes that you're getting from that forest management project. And that's seen in practice with the level of permitted modification that might occur in that forest that's technically protected. So in other words, if it was managed in a way that actually took it from a high biodiversity to a lower biodiversity state, that would be seen as a counterproductive option. So there's some literature suggests that that can happen within the rules of a, say, REDD+ scheme. Potential positives, though, are that this provides a really needed protection mechanism for existing biodiversity to find a way to keep those forests in place. And the payment for ecosystem services finance that this represents can support traditional uses, management practices and livelihoods based on sustainable use of that existing forest. So some of the considerations for pros and cons of this approach, one of the main ones is that the carbon gain calculation is really reliant on the counterfactual. And this comes through quite strongly in all of the nature-based project examples we're going to cover today. And what that is getting at is the assumption of continued decline. So you're really only making a gain if you assume that deforestation would happen. So there's probably a natural limit as to where that line of thinking really can be considered a gain. And instead, this is making us shift our attention to thinking about, well, what are all of the other benefits from protecting forests for other ecosystem services other than carbon? So other considerations are around selecting areas that might qualify for this avoided deforestation and the permanence of those gains in place. So is this finance line going to be continuing into the future for a long time? Or is that what would happen if it was discontinued? So that's some of these themes are going to come up in some of our other nature-based examples, but that's in a nutshell some of the considerations for avoided deforestation. Now we're going to turn to the more ecological restoration-based approaches. And there's two of them that seem closely related, afforestation and reforestation, but conceptually they're quite different approaches because only afforestation would have the potential to displace a non-forest ecosystem that used to be there. But in practice, they probably lie on quite a continuum because unpacking the literature, it becomes clear that even something that is framed as being reforestation really requires you to look at what is on that site or used to be on the site or might naturally be on that site that you're planning to reforest. So some of the similar considerations run through both of these project types when we look at our potential positives and negatives. So particularly in the case of afforestation, the key negative that comes out is the displacement of what was there before and the values and uses of that ecosystem. And so that really requires an impact assessment and a knowledge of what was there on the site beforehand. Both of these approaches could work to simplify diversity unless it's specifically addressed in the restoration planning. So it's a little bit similar to that concern around avoided deforestation, that you would ideally be restoring a fully diverse ecosystem in that place, be it a forest or something else. So there's some other indirect effects to consider with especially introducing trees into the landscape. They include things like the water demand of the trees if you're introducing them into, say, a dry climate, and that's going to have the potential to have quite a wider sphere of impacts from the project, particularly on downstream aquatic systems. And quite a few examples of concerns around invasive species spread associated with these projects, and that mainly occurs where an exotic species is targeted for the, say, afforestation project. And it's not just restricted to terrestrial projects. The same concerns have popped up in, say, marine afforestation projects with the choice of species for introduction. Some of the potential positives are, in this case, this is a mechanism that really can contribute to ecosystem restoration by aligning climate finance with the restoration objectives. And those restored ecosystems, if they're done well, and natural ecosystems can generally support traditional values and practices in a landscape that may have been lost through ecosystem degradation. And the co-benefits of having restoration financed and happening in the landscape can ultimately enhance the sustainability and permanence of those projects into the future. Some of the considerations we identified for these two project types were especially around the trade-offs of what was there before, particularly for afforestation. It will always involve a trade-off, whereas reforestation perhaps less likely. So moving now to wetland and blue carbon projects as a group, and this is quite a buoyant group around the world that's really gaining a lot of attention at the moment. Essentially, these projects are using really similar concepts to the restoration or protection examples we just covered in relation to forests. And again, the carbon gains of such projects reflect a difference from a counterfactual that must be a degraded state, and the restored state would have to represent more carbon for these to be viable carbon emission reduction projects. So looking at some of the positives and negatives here, again, we've got the same kind of considerations as for the forest-based projects. So you've got still the potential for leakage where you could shift the pressure somewhere else, and you've got the potential to displace the existing ecosystem type that was there, particularly if you're restoring it to a new area. Potential positives though, again, we've got a great mechanism for achieving biodiversity protection restoration gains, and additionally in this case with the ecosystem services of wetlands, we could be benefiting downstream ecosystems from their role in the wider hydrological cycle. And again, the ability to promote the restoration of ecosystems can support traditional values and practices and enhance the overall sustainability and permanence of these project types. Some of the considerations for the pros and cons of these projects are vulnerability to natural hazards, which is common to most of the ecosystem-based projects, but comes out quite strongly in the wetland blue carbon space because they're typically on the edge of the land, and they're exposed to natural hazards such as floods and erosion quite overtly. So that's a factor for considering the permanence of those projects and their resilience to change in the future, and would need to be factored into the project design in some way. And then moving on to our last one, we looked at some grassland management types, and as you probably saw in the first slide, there's a overlap here with the agricultural land management sector. We've restricted our attention to the natural ecosystem management space, but there's obviously a sort of a transition across to different forms of agricultural practices, especially when you consider things such as grazing practices in a sort of semi-modified landscape. So with that in mind, looking at some of the positives and negatives we found in the literature, similar to the other ecosystem manipulation types, such as wetland blue carbon projects, we've got potential to displace the existing ecosystem type, resulting in trade-offs from what was there. Positives again are potential to enhance the existing biodiversity of that site, and that could support or incorporate traditional use models. Considerations are similar to the other nature-based examples around the reliance on that counterfactual calculation. So what was actually there in terms of the carbon, and what the assumption of the land remaining in a degraded state means for the ability to get a carbon gain there. Also, permanence of the intervention looking forward, similar to the other nature-based approaches. So, putting all that together, we can flip the equation around the other way, and I'm only going to cover a couple of slides on this now. We have a section that reviewed the reverse exchange of ideas, so how biodiversity and natural ecosystems could help us achieve climate mitigation objectives. The graphic there on the screen just shows you for terrestrial ecosystems some of the carbon storage potential, but this idea has been explored in nature-based solutions for several different ecosystem types, including some aquatic ones. And one way of looking at this is to consider the scope of the existing carbon projects in terms of how they are harnessing these natural ecosystems. So to what extent they are looking to use natural ecosystems to capture carbon. So now we're circling back to some of Amina's material on the nature of the carbon markets globally. If we look at the ecosystem scope of these existing carbon projects, you'll see that most of them at the moment are looking at the forest sector, so afforestation, reforestation. And down on the bottom of the chart there, you can see another big bubble on agricultural land management. So that agricultural land management space is really quite buoyant at the moment, and a lot of effort going in there. Across the other ecosystem types and other carbon programs, there's a lot of development work going on, but they're yet to achieve scale. So that tells us a few things. One is that there's considerable interest in different kinds of ecosystems being harnessed, and the other is that they're in the early stages of being developed and they've got probably quite some potential for upscaling. So it's important to look at this alignment between carbon mitigation and biodiversity conservation right at about this time. So another way to look at this is the map that Amina showed earlier, and just looking at the scale of those opportunities to harness natural ecosystems, but also to think about their potential impacts. And as you saw with Amina's slide on this earlier, there's quite extensive global coverage at the moment, but also quite a few gaps in other countries that might adopt strategies along these lines in the future. So now I'm going to try to just wrap things up. Looking at that global snapshot across those sectors, can we see some comparisons and takeaway messages? So this slide doesn't appear in the report, but you will see if you look at the energy sector examples, some of the takeaway messages are that the mitigation gain in that case is, I think, quite readily measurable in terms of carbon emissions in the energy sector. So emission reductions is quite tangible, and I think that's a positive of that sector, and probably the reason why it's such a big focus to try to reduce emissions coming out of that sector. And going back to Amina's first slide, it's accounting for the majority of the global emissions, so it needs to be targeted. The biodiversity gains are really quite limited though. On our review, we didn't find many definite gains for biodiversity through those clean energy projects. On the other hand, there were considerable negatives, and a lot of them relate to the issues around these technologies effectively having quite a large footprint to capture sufficient energy to achieve the economies of scale. And that is related to them targeting essentially quite diffuse energy sources. So the negatives around displacement of existing ecosystem types, either in construction or operation, and the spatial extent of those impacts through connectivity with surrounding landscapes, supporting infrastructure that might be needed, and the supply chain effects, they all factor into the footprint of the potential negatives of those approaches. And on top of that, we have clear examples that the place-based impacts of the location of those projects is really important, and that puts a focus on finding suitable locations. So if we look at the other side of the equation now of the 4 examples that we had of nature-based climate solutions looking to harness natural ecosystems, some of the positives were that there's a clear mechanism there for the climate finance to contribute to some of the biodiversity conservation objectives, and that includes potential to restore degraded ecosystems. And that approach can help support other values that are supported by natural ecosystems in the environment, particularly traditional uses and practices that might have been lost. And there is the follow-on effect that if you're able to generate benefits across quite a few ecosystem services, then that might enhance the sustainability of these solutions in the long run. Some of the negatives, though, that come out of this review were the gains and expectations around those projects are really reliant on that counterfactual, and that counterfactual is often assuming that there's continued degradation. So that's definitely valid at the moment, but if you think ahead into the future, we'd hopefully move into a counterfactual that doesn't have the expectation of things continuing to degrade. Even with these nature-based projects, there's potential to have trade-offs with existing ecosystem services or ecosystem types that might be on the site beforehand. So that's still a consideration, much the same with the clean energy sector. And in addition, the permanence of the carbon and biodiversity and other ecosystem service gains is an issue that's common to most of these projects and needs to be sort of thought through in their design and what would happen if those finance streams were discontinued. And last slide now on some recommendations from the overall study. And the first one Amanda mentioned earlier is the need to review and align policies and really try to incentivize synergies between these two objectives. So to create policies that really require projects that can achieve both climate mitigation and biodiversity conservation objectives. We need to improve the reliability of the impact assessment processes that are applied to assess the climate mitigation proposals. And a really important aspect of this is to develop full cost accounting models for those carbon components. So something that Emma mentioned earlier about the need to really internalize all of the actual project impacts, and you'll see it quite clearly in some of the examples I covered earlier. The supply chain effects and the full footprint of the project needs to be considered in its totality to really get a handle on what its overall impact is on the environment or for carbon gains for that matter. So that would allow the projects to be more evenly compared for their potential positives and negatives for both climate mitigation and biodiversity objectives. And incorporating the other ecosystem services through either the assessment process, through safeguards on the climate finance models, and ensuring benefit sharing of those benefits is something that's still needed in most of the climate finance examples that we've covered. And lastly, moving towards some kind of adaptive approach to improve resilience to future disturbances that we can expect. And we're not going to go through that diagram on the screen there, but we have sort of created a map there of some of the moving parts that need to be considered to achieve these recommendations. So that's it from me. I've sped through, so apologies for that, but thanks very much for listening, and feel welcome to make contact anytime. Kia ora koutou.
Yeah, thank you both for your great interventions and presentation of these findings. So any comments from questions? I will check if, or please, if you want to ask something to the panelists, to the presenters, please. There are some messages here, but I would like just to, Mike, please, you are muted.
Thank you. And again, it's a wonderfully detailed report. Thank you so much. I mean, the first thought that comes to my mind is that I would like some time, and maybe it's worth running another seminar on this, to look at the recommendations and think about them in more detail, particularly with regard to the nature-based solutions aspects of this. And I'm thinking particularly of agroecological methods to restore the soil in agricultural landscapes, because that has not just a carbon sequestration benefit, but a number of related benefits, such as the hydrological societal cycle, water quality, etc., etc. So I think it would be really good to dive into some of those things in more detail. But thanks very much, and I look forward to reading the report again and thinking more about your recommendations.
Thank you, Mike. I think that is extremely important. And I think we don't have much time for really to go into much detail with the recommendations. So I think what you mentioned is really important and useful for what I mentioned at the beginning. No, what would be really the policy recommendations for the future? So any more comments, questions?
Yeah, I think in the chat box, one person, Belinda, commented on that we could connect biodiversity offsetting with these nature-based carbon projects. So,
Belinda, are you here? Can you?
Yeah, I'm there. I was actually like quite impressive of the activity. We have been like I represent from Sri Lanka. There are some of my joining members also representing in the discussion. We've done some restoration projects, but we've not thought about the carbon aspect of it because initially it started as a water conservation initiative. Thereby, it's restoring some degraded hill country, mountain forest. You call it alpine forest in different regions. Probably in time to come, we might be able to look into the carbon offsetting as well. I was wondering because the ones who are buying carbon are mostly corporates. So if there is a combining impact where you can showcase that by purchasing these carbon, you also mitigate adverse impacts and also restore degraded lands and also maybe facilitate the wildlife, that might also contribute in a longer run. That's what I felt during the presentation.
Thank you, Belinda, for your comments. Anyone else?
I think Sarah, she pointed out one thing about the what about starting with food and water security incentives when you talk about the policy intensive incentive from carbon market, sorry, carbon projects.
Sarah, are you still here? Or I don't think, yeah, please go ahead.
Myself. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So it's not my area of expertise, policy incentives, but I do know a bit about food security. And I did just finish that professional development training on the drought prediction. So that's what I'm just offering as a comment today, that I thought it was really phenomenal as a remote sensing scientist and a map maker, that the Google Earth engine allows us now to take huge stacks of decades of data and crunch it and give us outputs in, a couple of minutes. And so those predictive drought maps, I think could be very useful for any country.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yes, I can like to talk to that. There's a really good point because what we're seeing now is quite a lot of vulnerability to natural hazards, be they floods or droughts or physical cyclone storm event damage. And the same applies to infrastructure-based projects, I guess, within the clean energy sector, but it's more overt when you're thinking about these natural ecosystem management projects that they really are vulnerable to those kind of disturbances. So there's a couple of takeaway messages around that. One is that we need to be expecting them and factoring them into our accounting models, but potentially also thinking about the resilience of those systems as part of in a restoration or conservation through protected areas, those kind of tools, so that we're trying to decrease the risk, so we are retaining as much benefit as possible. So I think that's a real frontier for working on at the moment, and I think that actually dovetails into what Belinda was saying as well around looking at the other ecosystem services that are coming from these projects. We might not need to go all the way to biodiversity credits, but we're seeing it in the carbon markets in the form of safeguards or other environmental standards that are applied to the carbon credit that is recognised. And I think that's a really good practical starting point for the carbon markets to ensure that the credit represents something that is sustainable and at least has those safeguards for biodiversity, ecosystem services of other kinds other than carbon. So these things are starting to come together, but I think there's a lot of work to be done. It's quite an exciting space. Thanks for the comments.
Thank you, Shane. Any more comments?
I think I don't see any further comments here.
Yeah, I would like just to go back to you, Aminur and Shane, that perhaps if you can highlight some key recommendations for IUCN regarding the next negotiations, for the CBD negotiations. As you know, there will be a topic that deals with climate change and biodiversity. So I would like to ask you quickly if you can just summarize or highlight some key important elements that should be considered in our recommendation for the next CBD COP. Over to you, Shane and Aminur.
Shane, maybe I can comment on that. I mean, the follow-up of this, I mean, as Angela already said, that this report is not just a report. It's basically this will fit into the policy recommendations and through the COP, next coming COP in biodiversity COP as well as the climate change COP. And at the moment we are working on, I think, two fronts. One is the one motion within the IUCN Commission, so that IUCN's position will be clear on this the carbon markets and biodiversity conservation. And that one we are trying to basically focusing on the what are the key aspects of the global carbon markets and the carbon mitigation projects the policymakers should look at, and to some extent and in broader extent, I would say that the policymakers should look at the especially from our report's recommendation, then you will see we want to focus on three different aspects. Okay, one is not only just the emission reduction or carbon mitigation, at the same time the biodiversity enhancement and the social safeguards. So all three aspects should go together. So it should not be isolated, and that three things will basically ensure the environmental safeguards, social safeguards, and human rights and the equity within the society and within the project itself. And that will ensure the sustainability of those projects. And one of the key things we also highlighted that the nature-based climate solutions would be the key instrument promoting those things. So that will ensure three aspects. So that thing, I think, yeah. So from the IUCN's resolution as well as in the COP, we will also promote these things.
Thank you, Aminur. And Shane, do you have some specific recommendations to consider for the CBD COP regarding the connection?
Yeah, sure. Off the top of my head, thinking about the findings from the report, which is essentially quite a wide-ranging review, I think some practical steps that could help with this direction are in the clean energy sector to really look at expanding the impact assessments that are used to evaluate those projects to include the full range of ecosystem services so that they're being evaluated across their whole life cycles, but against all of their potential positives and negatives. So I think that's one tangible area that is needed. And I think what that will result in is placing a real focus on which sites really make sense for those kinds of developments and which perhaps don't. And I think that that'll always be a part of the mix. But on the other side of the equation, there's the upscaling the potential of the nature-based solutions approaches. And I think there are some tangible messages there that can be explored as well. They are more around overcoming some of the barriers to upscaling the nature-based approaches that we've covered. And some of them require impact assessment improvements as well, such as understanding what are the full range of benefits of those approaches and having those documented. Because much in the same way of looking at the clean energy projects, if it's understood that there's value across several different social and cultural ecosystem services and other values from these projects, then that should be factored into decisions on what goes where and how much investment we put in these various project types. So I think a focus on evaluating all of the costs and benefits of these project types is probably the common theme running through both sectors. And if that could be done well, I think it would benefit the overall picture to get the balance, probably more in favour of nature-based solutions, but working out where that balance should be. So it's a few ideas. Thanks.
Thanks. There is a question here on the chat, but I don't know if anyone can respond to that. Is there any current guideline for the conservation of genetic diversity within a species alongside the conservation of biodiversity itself? I don't know if this is something that we, with our knowledge, can respond or...
I don't have any idea about that. I mean, probably not at the genetic diversity level. It could be as a general guideline from IUCN, but I'm not sure.
No, I don't know if there is any at this point. I think this topic is quite complex, but I don't know if there is a guideline for that. Okay, so I think I really would like to thank again Shane and Aminur for the presentation. And I take the recommendation from Mike that I'm sure that this is extremely important for us. And I think we have to digest more the results of this publication and convene another session to really think about the recommendations. This is something that we can think for the next 2-3 months, something that can be useful for the World Conservation Congress. I think this is a very important topic that is very much connected with new ideas that have been raised in Council. For example, the discussion on biodiversity credits, that's something that is very much aligned with this discussion, that it was not covered by this document, but this is something that is increasing, and there are many countries, including my own country, Colombia, where people are thinking about that, and there are already some examples on how people think that this possibility can be developed, and also other initiatives regarding the relevance of these elements for the energy transition. This is very much connected. I think the insights that were provided are extremely relevant. And there is another initiative on nature positive. So as Aminur mentioned, we have been discussing in Council, and Aminur helped us quite a lot also proposing a draft for a possible motion requested to Council on carbon markets and providing a policy guide or policy document for IUCN in this respect. But we see that there are connections with all these other elements. So I think this will be really critical for the next months and ahead of I think after the COP, because we will be extremely busy with all these discussions during the next 2 months. But I think we can convene another call, another meeting and continue this discussion and see the connections with these elements: energy transition, biodiversity credits, and nature positive, and see what extent we can really provide one single message, no? Because if we start dividing things into pieces, I think we may have at some point some conflicts, and so it's better to connect all these elements. So I appreciate again very much to all of you for your participation in this session, and hope to see you soon in another CM dialogue and webinar. So thanks again. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.